Ashley Faus. I was going to say welcome back to the show, but this is the first time I think you've been on this show, even though I've interviewed you a couple of times on various other shows. But I'm looking forward to this conversation because we've been going back and forth now on LinkedIn about AI and when it's appropriate to adopt AI as a team. All right, that's the conversation we had. I even pulled up your last post where you brought up, you screenshotted a comment that I'd added on you had on one of my posts, and then you made a post about it. And I think like the conversation we're essentially having here, and this is a conversation less than an interview, is around like, when should teams adopt AI? Because for enterprise teams, it's like if you adopt it too early, you can get burned on it because the tech isn't quite ready. You lose trust, you break systems. Obviously, the small teams are doing it because they have less to lose. But enterprise teams, you got a lot to lose. I mean, you're talking about billions of dollars of revenue and trust and shareholders and government regulations. And you mean, shoot, we're seeing some enterprise companies lose legal battles right now because the chat bot made promises and it's part of their org. So courts are saying, you got to deliver the product for free, you know?
Well, and the copyright issues too. This is the other thing that's interesting. The legal battles are still playing out with like all the stuff with the New York Times, for example. So the legal landscape hasn't caught up to the tech landscape. And so it's not even an issue of a chatbot made promises. It's like, you don't know if you put stuff into some of these models, like the underlying terms of service. Who's reading that? Is your standard marketing coordinator reading that? They're definitely not. I don't know if you saw Chris Penn recently put something out. He's like, do you understand what you're signing away in the terms of service? And he's like highlighting it and saying,
does anybody understand what they sign in the terms of service? No, we're all signing our baby and our life away in terms of service agreements with every single company we work with, right? I mean, I think they even put out a documentary called like terms or sign away your life or something like that. Somebody did a documentary on going deep onto that and like how tech companies are essentially like screwing us all over, even though a lot of it obviously won't hold up in court, but like the things they put in there are so nuts. Like what are we actually signing when we do these? People have done like exposés on this, but still they're there.
Yeah. It's crazy. So all this to say, it is a timely conversation. And I think it's interesting for us to have it with me kind of on the enterprise side and then you on more of like the agency, the solopreneur, like you're building a really cool product that can do some cool stuff that's AI. And so I think that spectrum, we were joking before we started the record button of like, okay, how do we make this spicy? Like how spicy are we going to go? And I think acknowledging that there's a spectrum and, it's nuanced and it depends and all of that stuff. But
there's always nuance.
The other reality is, again, on the enterprise side, you don't always have time to have those nuanced conversations with 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 employees. And so you end up starting to get really roughly grained policies and rules that if you actually dig into them, that's maybe not what people meant to say, but it's the easiest way to not get in a legal battle or not break all the systems, right? So I do think that it's interesting to think about how do you take an incremental approach to this in a safe way, given that you might potentially put something out there that affects hundreds of thousands of customers or tens of thousands of employees.
Cool. So let's set some precedents here. Like where do you feel personally like AI is going to be 5-10 years from now? Do you think it's going to like kind of take over everything or it's going to be in its place?
I think it's going to be in its place. We saw this with marketing automation platforms. Like I remember the first time I saw Marketo and I was like, this is the future of marketing, right? And everybody said that HubSpot and Marketo and that marketing automation platforms were going to completely take over. It's going to eliminate the marketing jobs. And instead what happened is it spawned an entirely new class of jobs, like a Marketo specialist or a HubSpot specialist, right? A marketing automation platform specialist. So from my perspective, AI is going to be in its place. Is it going to change how we do our jobs? Yes. Do we need to wait to see how it's going to change our jobs? Yes and no. Again, when the legal landscape kind of eventually catches up, that will have some implications, but I think it's going to be in its place. I don't think that we're going to end up with no marketers and no writers and no artists and no graphic designers. Like, come on, guys. Humans love to work. We love to create work for ourselves. Like, we have a lot of we've had robots join
Yeah,
our everyday life for years, and yet we still work 40 to 60 hours a week. We like to
it's
create
true.
more for ourselves.
Like we still have people working in factories, even though automation's been heavy in factories since the early 80s, right? So there's definitely a precedence there as far as like automation and all that kind of stuff. We needed more people working the robots. And I guess a lot of the labor did go overseas. But even over there where they're still fairly automated making these iPhones, you still have a factory full of like thousands and tens of thousands of people working on iPhones, right? Because they
Exactly.
just can't do everything.
Exactly.
So there's definitely a precedence. Even Disney, as innovative as Disney is, Disney will not like introduce new tech into their ecosystem until it's like at least 8 years old. They're just
Yeah,
like, we can't risk bringing in something new and improved and shiny until it's at least been around for a long time. So it'll probably be a while before, and they're probably already been messing with AI for a long time. But you think they're going to introduce large language models into stuff they do? Heck no. It's going to be a while before Disney actually does because
exactly.
they can't risk something going wrong.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I get it. There's also on the other end, a lot of people are saying that, like, well, if you don't start now, then there's going to be a gap between you and the ones who do, right? Because there's this adoption curve, especially when it comes to like the data you have and the data you're compiling for it to train on. The sooner you get it training on it and improving it and it learning on how to do whatever your heck you want it to do sooner, the better it gets. And those are the kind of conversations people are having. It's like, well, then there's this like early adoption thing where if you kind of go to and start moving it along, even if it's rough at first, yeah, but 5 years from now, you have a 5 year head start by the time it's actually mature or whatever. So
But then the
that's
question
a risky
is,
game too.
if it's going to be so much better with, and some of this, again, this is why in one of my posts, I differentiated between the adoption cycle and the hype cycle.
Yeah.
A lot of people are kind of mixing that and primarily talking about the hype cycle and, does AI live up to the hype? Well, if AI will live up to the hype in 5 years, is the learning curve actually going to be easier in 5 years? So there's some interesting things too, where, you talk about digital natives and why they are so much faster at picking up technology. And it's because they don't have any preconceived notions about how it should work. And so if you think about like with the way computers have evolved, right? Like you used to have to put a disk into a computer. And so that icon to save being a disk, the reason that that is the icon is because it used to be like
Yeah.
when they first introduced it, that was the way that they could build the bridge between physically
Yep.
saving on a
Yep.
disk and saving it on your
Right.
computer. If you ask digital natives about that, they have no idea why that icon is what it is, right? And now they've grown up in a world where everything just auto saves. You don't have to hit the save button, it just auto saves, right? So they never actually had to undo the knowledge of saving to a physical disk, translating that mentally into an icon on a screen, to a button that you push, right? Like they didn't have to do any of that. And so there's an element of it where I almost wonder if it's almost like the digital natives thing of like AI,
Yeah.
where my nieces and nephews are actually going to be so much better at it. Like the thought of me calling out to Siri or the G word, I don't want to say it because it's going to be like, "Hello, can I help you?" No, you can't help me. But like
Yeah.
I that's not fluent for me. Like we don't have a bunch of smart home devices like that. And so but for
Yeah.
my nieces and nephews, they already
Yeah. It is.
know to call out for the lights or for the music or whatever.
Yep.
So it's I actually don't know if I totally buy into you're going to be 5 years behind if you don't start now.
I'm gonna push back on that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I after working at a college, a lot of people had told me like, "Oh, Gen Z so tech savvy," and I worked with them. I'm like, no, they're not. They
Yeah.
know how to consume it. They know how to receive it. They know how to go and engage with it, but they know nothing about how to actually use it for productivity's sake. I'm like, I had to train them on how to actually like use social media, not for personal self, but like, no, okay, let me teach you how to do it for a business.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, if they were actually good at being a creator, they did that. That translated perfectly. Even if it was like them being a fashion like guru, whatever, on Twitter and Instagram, that knowledge, and they built a following with that. that knowledge did translate. So if they were a creator, because being a creator is almost like being a marketer, you have
Totally.
to reverse engineer what the audience wants and give it to them, and cycles and all, so many marketing lessons. But most of them, yes, they know how to get around Facebook and Instagram or TikTok or whatever the heck the platform is better, but only from a consumer perspective, not from a work perspective.
So the interesting thing that you're pointing out here, which is part of why I don't think AI is going to replace all of us, the underlying skill is not actually the tech. The underlying skill is the human connection or putting together an outfit or
Yes.
eliciting an emotion via song or via images or whatever it is, right? Like the thing
Yep.
that is actually transferable is still the core human
Yes.
connection. And
Yep.
so I think that is fair. That is a fair pushback because I've seen that as well working with some early career folks. That sense of, you know, calendar management, time management, inbox management, Slack management, right? Like the thing that is hard about that is not actually pushing the buttons on Slack or like organizing your channels on Slack or making folders in your inbox. The thing that's hard is managing your attention and prioritizing all of the information that's coming in from all of these different places. That's the actual skill. So that's a fair
Yeah.
pushback. I don't know, and we can get into this, right? Like I'm just using AI the wrong way, but I've been trying to like, all right, I'm gonna test it out, right? And I've tried to get Chat GPT to like everybody keeps saying, "Oh, I love it for planning trips. I love it for like planning." And so I keep trying to get it to plan.
I
I
haven't
think
done it
it's
for dribble.
terrible at
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Terrible. It plans the worst date night ever for me and my husband. I, like already had a date night in my head, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I had actually literally brought it up to him and I was like, "Hey, I have some ideas of like what we could do, whatever." And so then I was like, this is a great opportunity for me to test my Chat GPT skills. So I was like, okay, Chat GPT, like, and I put in a little bit of info about like who we are and what we like and what, and literally said like plan a date night for today that includes dinner and an activity. And it was like, here's three different restaurants you could try. And I'm like, that's not helpful. Like I know restaurants. I could pick a restaurant, right? And it's like, you don't I don't know. I don't know what these people are using it for that's good at planning a trip or a date night, but I think it's terrible at that.
I'm like looking for a conversation I had in Chat GPT recently. I'm like, but I have so many, it's hard to find them all. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
gosh. I had one where I threw it a curveball that I didn't know where it would go,
Yeah.
but I threw it a parenting question. As I'm good at thinking about marketing stuff. So, but I'm like, parenting, it's kind of pretty tough. I'm like, but I had a very specific problem that I needed a solution for. And I could have gone to Google, but I'm like, I don't think someone might have written an article about this, but I think ChatGPT can do this. So I have two older kids, a 10-year-old and a 11. She's about to turn 12. And we have these moments because we homeschool where they just get overwhelmed and they run into these growth or fixed mindset issues
Yeah.
where they're like, I can't do this. I don't get it. And it's like, it's very fixed mindset. Like clearly you can get it. You just have to keep working at it. You need to choose a growth mindset. But I'm like, it's not enough for me to tell them, hey, you have a fixed mindset. Let's choose the growth mindset. That's not a bad place to start. But I was like, okay, Chat GPT, here's the situation. I kind of break down like, hey, I'm a parent. I'm trying to teach my kids how to have a better growth mindset. They're running into a fixed mindset issue where they believe like they can't do something. What is not something I can just tell them or review with them? Can you give me a process that I can run through them that becomes a go-to process every time they run into this specific limiting belief, this fixed mindset? And what it gave me, this 5-step process, I was like, yeah, this is fantastic. Actually, I don't know where I got it from. Now, maybe if I did it in Perplexity, where it actually cites all its sources, like it would have told me where it got the idea from. But it was fantastic, and I need to actually pull it out and print it off and like start working into my parenting rhythm. But I actually thought it was pretty good. I have seen people like post videos about what you ran into with date night, kind of like, hey, let's see what ChatGPT did for us. And then they like go through a day in their vacation. It's like, this was horrible advice. Like, this was a horrible day. What we could have
Why?
done was.
Yeah. Well, it's
So I have
interesting,
seen the
right?
vacation or date night nightmares that ChatGPT has planned.
Well, it's interesting because as you were talking about the parenting thing, I thought the punchline was going to be that, like, oh, it just pulled out like step one, believe in yourself. Step two, say I believe in myself, right? Like these
Yeah.
platitudes.
No, that's why I'm looking for it. If I could pull it up, you'd hear
Yeah.
it.
And the interesting thing is, I almost want to play a game of like AI versus Ashley because, as you were talking about that, there's actually a really interesting article that Harvard Business Review wrote years ago at this point called The Trouble with Bright Girls. And it actually talks about that. And you're probably actually combating some of this by homeschooling, but the way that the education system is set up tends to work very well in the early years for girls compared to boys because they have to sit down and they have to be orderly. And so they're constantly praised for being so smart. Versus boys, since they tend to be more unruly and high energy, they're constantly told if you would just sit down and focus, if you would just work harder, if you would just try. And so the
Yeah.
girls are basically praised for something they're quote unquote, inherently good at. And the boys are constantly told to work harder so that by the time they get into higher levels of math or science, hard things, if the girls can't do it or it's hard, then they're like, well, I just can't because I'm inherently not smart enough versus the boys are like, oh, I just have to work harder. Right. So it's this super interesting, even the language shift
Yep.
makes a huge difference, right, in how you cultivate that growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So it's interesting because, you got this process and I'm like, did it just read that article and pull it from that article? Like, if so, good job, Chat GPT. But
So
like,
no.
would that have been the top Google search result if you'd Googled it? Right. So there's some really interesting things that I think it,
The thing that it did though that Google will never be able to do until it incorporates AI, and it's working on that, is that it made it contextual to the exact specifications I had.
yeah,
Right? Where Google articles, it's going to be kind of off a little bit. Then you have to reverse engineer it in your head to fit the context, and that's kind of exciting. But how does this translate into like business and enterprise? Now, like Dave Ramsey, which is a big company locally to me, they're embracing AI, but they've like made a policy. It's like nothing public facing will be AI generated because we're a trust brand
yeah,
and we have too much at stake to be able to generate AI stuff without it. At least has to pass through a person 100%
yeah,
proofread. But like we will not like everything will be human created because we can't afford it. But they're still playing with it on the back end, and they're using it for like a boss needs to be come up with a growth plan for something that an employee gets stuck in. So they're just starting off with Chat GPT to kind of like brainstorm and then be like, hey, it's pretty good, copy paste, good.
yeah.
So it's like they're using it for stuff like that all the time. I wonder, are you doing stuff like that in your job at Atlassian?
Yeah. So we actually have Atlassian Intelligence, which runs across our platform. And so we have access to that internally. We've got our own little playground where, it's a safe space basically where we can put stuff in,
Yeah.
we can connect it into our internal systems. So there's actually some pretty funny things. So we on one of our teams, Slack just rolled out their AI summaries or whatever, and we have a bunch of Taylor Swift fans on our team. And so somebody jokingly, when Tortured Poets Department dropped, and nobody said anything, and so she popped in, and she was like, doing a wellness check, like, Dan, Ashley, are you okay? Like, we've heard nothing about Tortured Poets, department yet. And so we were all kind of laughing. We're like, well, yeah, because they're off listening to the album. They're not on here. They haven't formulated their deep thoughts
Yeah.
about it yet. And so then the next day, one of our teammates who had been on vacation was like, yeah, I'm going to test out the new AI Slack summaries. And it pulled it up and it was like, the teammate expressed concern for Ashley and Dan's well-being about Taylor Swift. This other teammate also expressed concern. And she was just like, this is the best thing ever. So there's still some limitations. Like, it is handy. We have AI summaries at the top. So like if you write, a big strategy plan and then you want to generate a summary for the top of like executives or if somebody stumbles on the page, then you can adopt the AI. And obviously you can edit it, but you can hit,
Yeah. Yeah.
summarize this page and it'll put at the top. We have stuff that's been rolled out externally. So it'll summarize, like if there's an incident or support tickets. And so if you're the person who's coming on for your shift for support, it'll do an AI summary of all of the tickets. So you don't have to go through, every single comment that's come up. You can get a sense of where the queue is. So we're definitely incorporating it in that way. I think the hard part is when we think about, and again, some of this is like, where does the human stop versus where does the human start? Like we've also used it. We wanted to rename a newsletter. And so, put in a little prompt and have it just spit out like 30 different names. And of those names, like 2 or 3 were actually good and the rest you throw away, but you really only need
Yep.
one good name. You don't actually, and so there's part of it where I personally struggle with this because I'm like, I mean, only one of these is even usable. Right. But that's the only, you only need one usable one. And
Only
a
need one. Yeah.
human is going to start to tap out at maybe 15. Chat
Yep.
GPT, you could just be like another one, another one, another one, another one.
Yeah, but its ability to get better doesn't get
Still
better
gonna
the more you
improve.
produce.
Exactly. Right. So
Yeah.
so there's some of that where it's like I dealt with this the other day for myself. I was like, this is a perfect example. Session titles for inbound, right? I just ran a poll to say, like, help me crowdsource my topic. And I was already starting to think of titles for these sessions. And I was like, this is a
Yeah.
perfect thing for Chat GPT to help me with, for me to practice my
Yep.
skills. So I went to it and I said, here's who you are. And I told her, I was like, you're a copywriter at Nike and you used to work at Apple and Ogilvy. So like you're a boss at this. And, here's the audience. And I said, and you've already come up with these 3 taglines, make the others. And so I gave it what I put in. And then obviously hit do it again. And I gave it, I was like, that's interesting. I noticed that you keep asking questions. Can you restate these as declarative sentences instead? And it was like, yep. And in some cases it tweaked it. And in other cases it didn't. Right. And I asked it again. I was like, these are good, but why don't we focus on alliteration? Why don't we focus on rhyming? Why don't we? And so I was tweaking it. And so, yes, the quality of the prompts does matter and the quality of the input matters, but it's just, it's just hard because like I'm actually really good at this stuff and I have the full context of exactly what the topic is. And by the time I write out the full context that's in my head, I've already used that context to come up with 5 really good titles already. And so like it's not totally on one hand it's not very fair that I maybe write this 2,000 word page and AI just has to write 2 sentences and it's like, well, if the 2 sentences are bad, maybe your 1,000 words are bad. But at the same time, by the time I have to give it 1,000 words to make it better, like I could have just taken a walk around the block and done it myself. Like there's still some of that hard nuance. And same thing, even the support tickets, right? Like how often do you still have to potentially reach out to a teammate and say, "Hey, do you have 5 minutes to just give me a quick download on this?" Writing is hard. Humans struggle with writing.
Naming's hard.
Naming's hard. Like so I think there's some of that too where if you give it the wrong problem, the assumption that, oh, well, this is hard for humans, but it's easy for AI is not, there's a reason certain things are hard for humans. Like the reason date night is so hard to plan is because humans are finicky. And well, I normally like Mexican food, but tonight I want, Chinese food. And it gave me a Mexican restaurant. So it doesn't, well, it doesn't know that you want Chinese food tonight. Like that's not fair,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's the same thing in business. In some cases, like another use case that we're doing is, and again, you're going to do it for this episode. You're going to put it through whatever the AI tool is, maybe the one you're building. It's going to
Yep. Yep.
generate 20 clips of whatever we talked about. You're going to pick the top 5. You're going to send me 3. You're going to keep 2 back for yourself. I'm going to listen to those 3 clips, pick one to promote this episode. Like that's how this is going to go. What that means is that 15 of the clips that it generates are useless. Is that because we didn't have anything useful to say? Or is it because it
Sometimes.
couldn't pick up, right? Like, or is it because it
Yeah.
couldn't pick up where the best bits are?
It's a combination of both because I do a lot of those. I mean, I'm generating clips multiple times a week for different clients and I'm having to go through and pick them out myself. And sometimes some episodes, because of the person being interviewed, has a higher clip rate. And it's very interesting because you can usually tell just by listening to them, you're like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. They're going to get more clips because they don't meander through. They're more concise and give concise points. So you can tell like how they communicate and what they're saying is just more clippable. And it would have been the same for a human. Whether an AI did it or a human did it, they still would have had a higher clip rate than normal. Like a human would also struggle to get good clips out of a someone who just kind of meandered through and didn't make solid points, wasn't concise, didn't have anything new to say.
Yeah.
So I have noticed that, but it is getting better at finding good clips. I don't know, its ability to find higher clips is better. And I do notice how they rank stack them now from like most likely to be good to least likely to be good. that's generally right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Its
Well, and
rating system, I'm like, I don't know how it knows which ones are going to be better, but I get less clips at the bottom of the pile. That's for sure.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's so one thing that's interesting that we're seeing that is a combination of obviously the source material that you put in and the quality of what you get out, but sometimes it's off by just like 10
Yes.
seconds,
Yeah, that's
right?
right. That's pretty frequent that I'm pushing it 10 seconds one way or the other.
Yeah,
Very
and it's
normal.
like it's
Yeah.
almost that sense of I'm gonna again, this conversation, for example, I already know that this is not the smartest conversation I've had precisely because I'm so early in my journey on it, compared to conversations we've had in the past about thought leadership or
Hmm.
about content
Yep.
strategy, where I
Yep.
have good one-liners, right? So if we were to say, we'll go back to something that I'm more familiar with, where I would say, the funnel is dead, use a playground instead. Okay, what do you mean by that, Ashley? What are the top 3 things that you need to think about? Well, you have to address content depths, you have to address intent based content, and you have to use explicit CTAs. It's like it would clip it at just the funnel is dead. What should you do? No, I gave you the one liner of the funnel is dead, use a playground instead. And I gave you content depths, intent based content, and explicit CTAs. Why did you cut it off at just the first part? Like, clearly, the valuable piece is the second part. And so we've seen that a few times where, or it'll say, we're doing it for our products, right? And it's like, we're going to announce a new feature. And so we put it out there and it's like, and now announcing. And then it like cuts the clip there. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
clearly we need whatever the announcement is. If it's Jira dark mode.
What tool are you using?
So I don't want to be rude. We're
Okay.
working on a couple of
I'm not
tools
going to
here.
throw them
So
under the
I'll
bus.
I'll I'll DM you separately. And I know, of course, this is gonna be the clip where you're gonna be like, here which tools Ashley says she's using. I'm gonna stand behind the
Yeah,
Atlassian policy of not naming tools that have not been fully
that's
vetted
fair.
yet. Again,
That's fair.
when a large brand like us says we're using something, it gets a little twitchy. So we're still
Okay. We won't do
experimenting.
that.
We have seen quality, a variety of levels with a number of
Yep.
tools. And now we could solve that. We could just go manually clip it and just extend it. And so basically the way
Of
we're
course.
using it is give me 10 clips, give me a sense for what's interesting. And I can tell within the first few seconds of like, what are you even talking about? No one cares. Like, discard this.
Yeah, yeah,
Or,
yeah.
oh, this is super interesting. Let me listen to the end. And then when they clip, if they cut it short, then I can just be like, okay, I know exactly where to go and just say extend it.
Yeah. This could be an episode about clips really fast, but I'm going to try to steer it back to the enterprise because I'm like, there's so much I could say about clips, but
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll talk afterwards. You'll give me your best practices and then you'll be
yeah, yeah. Some things I've learned about clips, but you talked a lot about on LinkedIn, like the opportunity cost of learning AI to maximize what you could be getting out of it now versus what you could be getting out of what's currently available right now and working well. You know what's funny about that is I feel like nothing's really working well right now. Like there's not like a killer, like, oh, LinkedIn ads are killing it. It's when I go to every single channel, it's like everything's expensive, everything takes a long time. Anything that's fast is not that great. I feel
well,
like
I
in
mean, the
marketing right now,
triangle
there's
holds
no killer,
true.
and the economy is kind of like struggle. I don't mean anybody's being like, oh yeah, we're freaking killing it right now.
Yeah.
Which right now I'm like, well, I might as well dig into AI and make what I'm currently doing more efficient. Is kind of how I'm seeing leveraging AI to do better faster.
Yeah.
How do you see the
Well,
opportunity cost?
yeah. So like there's the triangle of good, fast, or cheap. Pick two, right? If it's going to
Yeah.
be good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. If it's cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. If it's good and cheap, it's not going to be fast, right? Like those things. The point I was actually trying to make was less about strategies and tactics and more about skills. So, I have 15 years of experience in my craft. I'm very good at what I do. And because of that, trying to get someone else to do it is really hard, whether that's a human or a robot. And I know we've had this conversation a little bit too. You're like, yeah, AI is kind of like the interns. You have to break it down and you have to give them step by step. You have to
Yep.
do a
Yep.
playbook. I actually really loved, again, I know I keep going back to Chris Penn, but like he's been in this world for like 10 years. It's like you were what is it? It's like you merely adopted the darkness and I was born into it. I feel like that's like Chris Penn. Like you're the adopter and he's the I was born into it kind of guy. But he was talking about templates and he said anything that you do with a template today is an excellent use case for AI tomorrow. And where tomorrow is very near term. Do a lot of things with templates because at the point where I am the person doing it, you need you need me. It can't actually be done by a template by the time it gets to me because
Yeah.
otherwise you would have done it already. And so I think that's what I'm talking about with the opportunity cost. The work that I'm doing to me still requires a human. And if I'm the human required to do it, it probably means you need someone who's got 15 or more years of experience. And like that's a different level of work. And so for me to figure out how to distill what I just know because I've been doing this for so long into a set of written instructions for someone else to do what I do, like that takes a lot of time. And then the question is, why would I invest that time in the robot instead of in the humans on my team that I'm supposed to be investing in, right? Like
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
also there's some feeling aspects to it too, where I actually had a conversation with someone else who was an early career person, and they were talking to me about some struggles with somebody who was more senior on their team who was supposed to be giving them feedback. And they kept asking for feedback. And the senior person said, well, why don't you just try it? Use it with Chat GPT. I don't have time. Just put it into Chat GPT. And they were like so offended. And I said, well, maybe the delivery was not right, but is it possible that you could have done that task without the more senior person you were trying to do it with, right? And I think it doesn't feel good if your manager tells you basically, I don't have time for you. I'm going to go train a robot instead. Like how does that make you feel from a career growth standpoint or a job stability standpoint? It doesn't feel great. And then now at some point I'm still going to have to teach you something. So am I going to teach you the AI? And the answer might be yes, but as we talked about kind of at the beginning of the conversation, with that learning curve, does it make sense for me, who's a bit blind, to lead you, who's a bit blind, instead of giving you, who doesn't have as differentiated of a skill set yet because you don't have as much experience? Why don't you be the one to learn this and spread it to the organization, right? It's a good growth opportunity. It's a good visibility opportunity. It sets you up well from a long-term perspective, and it minimizes the opportunity cost of having me do it when I already have like my old school skills are actually still better
Oh, for
than
sure.
the new school skills, right? So there's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's not a straightforward conversation, especially when you're talking about humans on your team and what precedent does that set about where I invest my time if I only invest it in systems and process and tools and I don't invest in the humans.
I don't know. It seems pretty stark when you compare it to like giving it to AI or giving it to people when it could just be a spectrum a little bit. I mean, obviously, you don't compare AI to people. It's kind of like, oh, I'm only giving you 80% today, so I'm giving 20% to the AI. It's just part of like, kind of like you spend time in Salesforce or HubSpot tuning up a dashboard so that you can get more out of it. The thing I'd like to know from you is there anything you do that's just pretty repetitive
I mean,
and you
the
walk through the same process every time you deal with it? Because
yeah,
those
I
are the
mean,
opportunities where I find AI can help. Usually, it's in one of those. Like
yeah.
I found that naming is a kind of a weird thing because it is something you have to do. There is a process to it. Some people have different processes, but I finally found a book that I loved from Alexandra Watkins, and she had a fairly particular process that was very straightforward, using essentially words defining a name and then finding idioms that those words were in, and then finding the or no, it's like word rhymes with that word, idioms with that rhyme in it, and then swapping back out the original word. Do that a lot for the thing you're trying to name. It's one of her approaches, and that's how I came up with like Might Club for one of the podcasts we launched, is Fight Club. Oh, that's kind of a different feel. It takes on a little bit of that feel from Fight Club, but now it's Might Club,
Yeah.
right? So that's her naming process. Chat GPT is really good at running that process, and it'll get better as it gets more advanced and GPT-5 comes out and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's fully capable. Shoot, I mean, an algorithm can almost run that process.
Yeah.
It's so simple.
It's interesting
But
because
yeah,
yeah, the stuff that I find to be repetitive, for example, but it's not exactly that where you could say like you just need to put in the one, like you have to have the original idea of Fight Club, for example, and then you put that in,
yep,
you say,
yep,
okay, here's you're going
yep,
to run her process, and here it is, right? But onboarding documents, especially whenever I'm hiring in clusters where if I'm hiring 2 or 3 people within a quarter of each other, the onboarding documents are pretty similar. And it's you would think like, oh, just copy and paste the previous onboarding doc and it's fine, right? But a perfect example, when I built the APMM program for Atlassian, so it was a cohort of 4. So I had a joint onboarding plan for all of them that was, here's the Atlassian business, here's some of the key teams, markets, et cetera. And then I had individual plans for each of them. And the most annoying part of those plans was all 4 of them were supposed to book a one-on-one with each other. And so basically like swapping out the headshots and the names of the people to be like, Dan, Ashley's your teammate. Ashley, Dan's your teammate, right? Like I wanted it to feel
yeah,
personalized to you. So I didn't want
yeah.
you to be a teammate on there. And like, and again, this was a couple years ago, so I didn't have access to AI, but like that type of thing of being able to say like if I could put in this level of person should have one-on-ones with this level of person from these teams. So, you wouldn't have a VP meet with every new grad, right? But you might have all the new grads meet each other. Trying to like map those out for every single person. It's like if I could just tell the AI, like tweak this onboarding plan, they're
Yep,
still going to have a certain, 9 out of
yep,
10 of the people I want them to meet are the same, or they need to meet someone from every single team, match them with the appropriate level of person given their level. Like that would be something that would be so helpful. And then the other thing, which we do have this of like suggestions where it'll say at the bottom of a Confluence page, these pages are frequently read together, or like people who read this page often read this other page. So for an onboarding document, that would be super helpful if it could like look back at what I've been working on and see, okay, all the people who are on my team have been working on these 10 documents, and then basically do a little write up of like recent projects that you should know about. And then it can pull in all of those versus me having to be like, all right, which of these things are useful for a new person coming in? Because, I don't want to pull something from 2 years ago. That's not helpful. Like, I want to pull the last quarter of work to kind of get them up to speed. That would be a perfect example where I think there's probably ways to do most of this. But again, for me to find
probably
them,
if you're using Copilot or something for
yeah, like
Microsoft. Do you guys
integrate
use
them.
Microsoft?
I think we do have, I mean,
You're kind of big enough that I'm like, you might have your own internal systems for stuff
yeah,
like
we
that.
have some internal
You have
things.
your own
Well,
spreadsheet systems and all
this
that
is the
stuff. Yeah.
thing, right? Like that's the other question of like there might be some beta stuff that other teams are
Microsoft's
using.
almost a competitor at this level, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some frenemy stuff going on. We got
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
AI
Yeah.
stuff, they got some AI
For sure.
stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes our
Yeah.
AI stuff works together, right?
Yeah.
But this is again where I have all the knowledge in my head of who they should talk to and what we've been working on, all of that. For me to go find the tools and prompt it to do that feels like it's going to
Yep.
take as long
It,
or longer
it does
than
take
if I
longer,
just sit there
but
and type it out, right?
it really becomes this calculation of is it worth building a process for? Is the amount of time I'm going to spend building a process worth the time I'm going to save later having to do this over and over again? How much time does it take me? How often do I do it? Because if I can get back that time over, and then you start doing a cost, like what is that, a break even analysis on time?
Yeah,
Really, you're trying to think when the payback period is. It's like if I'm gonna get it back, like one thing I use is a showrunner for pre interviews, and it's already paid for itself well over. I invested time into that in December, and I
yeah,
use it every week for almost all my interviews. And it saves, I mean, it only saves me like 30-60 minutes, but it only takes 5 minutes to run. And so it's
yeah,
just so much faster that over time I've banked all that time I've saved back using that over and over again now. So everybody's got to run their own analysis on that. I do it even if I don't save time on it just to freaking learn sometimes because I'm like, oh, I wonder if it's capable of doing this. Let's find
yeah,
out, and I'll just do it.
yeah.
But I just had a client that I built he had a strategy consulting process where he was forecasting scenarios for businesses based on different trends that were taking place in their industry. And he had a storytelling format that he had that was really precise based on two different trends with two different factors per trend, usually like if it goes up or down or whatever. And then like, hey, tell a story. What does 10 years look like out economically, sociologically, politically, like all the different things? What does the lead up look like? And he had a bunch of different things. I'm like, it's perfect use case for AI because now AI is really good given all the right context to then fill in the story of what could be with all the different ways this could pan out. And that used to take him 2 weeks to do that per client, per scenario. But now he can do it rapid fire live with the client. And now what used to take 2 weeks now takes, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, and he can sit there and play around with it live with the client. So I feel
Yeah.
like AI is going to be filling in a lot of gaps like that used to, I mean, but what does that do? He probably replaced the person on his staff doing that now.
It's interesting though, because again, going back to the marketing automation platforms and how we're just going to fire all the marketers, that's not what happened.
You're
You
right.
you either tilt them to running the robots, right, and refining
Yep.
it and whatever,
Yep.
or you give them a new job. And yes, there, as we have seen throughout history, every time there is a new innovation, there are some people who are not, it doesn't work out very well for them, right? Like, and that's not great. And we do need to have a conversation about that at a larger scale, about reskilling, upskilling, the fact, again, like in the US, the fact that basically healthcare is tied to a job. And so if you don't work a traditional job, you now don't have access to healthcare. Like AI quote unquote, replacing people, and then now they're homeless or they don't have healthcare. Like that is not the fault of AI. There's some systemic things that we got to have a conversation about, right? Like, and again,
Yeah. It's a scary thing if you're
even
predicting
culturally, like,
95% of marketers are going to lose their job, right? That's
yeah,
Sam Altman's prediction. I'm like,
yeah,
95 is a lot, Sam.
yeah.
Okay, but
Well, and
to be fair, his prediction isn't 95% people are going to lose their jobs. He says the AI will be doing 95% of what marketers are currently doing now, which is more specific than job
yeah,
loss. People equate that to job loss, but I'm like, well, it's obviously going to make new jobs, but even if he's only half right, then I'm like, that's still a lot of
still like
work.
50%.
It's
Well,
still
but the other,
50% of what's currently being done by AI. It'll add 20% back, but there's still probably going to be a shortfall in there somewhere. And that's kind of what I'm expecting is that there will be a shortfall between jobs added and jobs now automated.
well, and the other piece of this, and again, it gets back to, you know, I've seen a couple of folks, Perry Hedrick talks about this from a PR standpoint. He's like, for all the agencies that are charging by the hour, you're screwed because AI makes that a lot faster. So when we start talking about value of work, and again, this gets back to my thing of like, by the time you have me doing something, you need me to do it. It's not, you didn't just accidentally be like, I don't know, I wish somebody could help. Like you don't pay someone with my experience, my salary to do a certain type of work. Like that's inefficient. And whether it's an AI doing it, whether it's an intern, whether it's an agency,
Yeah.
whatever, right? Like there's a reason that more senior people are paid more.
Yeah.
And that if you find out that they're doing all the time, they're doing junior level work, that mismatch, you want to stop them from doing that
Yeah.
because you don't want to pay humans to do that work, right? So again, this question of, well, if 95% of the tasks that humans are doing, if the humans are only going to do 5% of the work, that doesn't necessarily mean you only need 5% of the humans. It means that the 5% of work that humans will still do is hard. And you can't, it's not going to work the same way to say you have to log in for 8 hours a day, you have to sit in a chair for 8 hours a day. My comment about by the time I put all this into a prompt for Chat GPT, I could just take a walk around the block and come up with it myself. Like that's literally the real example where I was walking around the block and my mind was kind of wandering and I had this in my subconscious and I started coming up with stuff and I'm like running back to the house to like, because like I was like, no, I'm not going to take my phone or anything. And I'm like repeating these things to myself over and over so I don't forget them. This happens to me all the time. I'm at the gym or I'm on the water. Like I am somewhere else and my brain is doing what it does because humans are going to human. And our brain is smart and it likes to be creative and it likes to find patterns. And if you just let it percolate a little bit, but like, how do you account for that time out of the office where I did that work? You're getting a very good value from me for doing that work outside the office, right?
Yep.
So we also have to fundamentally rethink how we judge the value of human work and how we compensate the value of human work, because that's ultimately the issue. Again, going back to some of these systemic things, the reason everyone's so stressed about losing their jobs is because it means they can't eat and they can't go to the doctor, and that's the real pain point. They're not worried about being bored or looking stupid. They're worried that they can't fundamentally meet the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so that's the other big shift as we think about this from a business standpoint. That's hard because the point of business is to basically maximize profits, maximize shareholder value, and you're going to run into some of the same issues we ran into when we had the manufacturing and the industrial revolution about you know the humans.
Yep. The one thing that helps me sleep better at night when it comes to mass job loss is the fact that marketing is kind of a black hole, and it will always take more. My boss told me that early in my career. He's like, I could feed 10 times the amount of budget, staff, and talent into that thing called marketing, and it'll take all of it.
Yep.
So I'm
100%.
like, well, since it's a black hole, like, can AI fill that black hole? Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe
Ultimately,
not.
the thing that will happen, this is my prediction now. We'll see if it works out or you combat it really fast. But I feel like like companies will make a certain amount of revenue. They'll want to invest a certain amount of that in order to make more revenue. Now, I think a percentage of that goes towards people. It's usually a big percentage. I think tech as a general category will slowly eat away at that more and more as tech becomes more effective. But it'll be a balance of like, do we get this new tool or do we hire more people? Which is a thing that people are already judging, but as tech becomes more effective, it'll probably eat up a bigger percentage of the puzzle, like of the pie, as far as what they're able to invest and still have a healthy margin for profit.
Yeah, the interesting piece of that is I think that the skills or again, the work that the people do will shift. I Somebody still has to implement the tech, somebody still has to
Yep.
buy the tech, somebody still
Yep.
has to review the legality of the tech, somebody still
Yep.
has to review the compliance of the tech, right? Like somebody still has to tell you the tech exists. I it I don't know. Again, I just feel like humans are really bad at working themselves out of a job. Like we really are. And even if we work ourselves out of one job, we manage to find another job to do. So I agree with you. I do think that there are still a lot of companies that have not even caught up to I was
True.
on a call the other day. I did like an AMA and somebody was
Yeah.
asking me, they were talking about like a super old school CRM system. And I was like, I'm sorry, you're using which one now? Oh, I didn't realize they were still
They're still
still
around.
existing.
Yeah.
Cool, right? Like there's I think you Dan, obviously on the AI side, like you are very early adopter, both in the adoption cycle and the hype cycle, right? I would say I'm skeptical on the hype cycle because that's how I roll. From an adoption standpoint, I think at this point anybody who's willing to like play with it and has an account and trying it is probably in the early adopter category or like early majority
I'd say
category
that's
of
true.
the adoption cycle, right? But
Even my tech savvy friends are only just now signing up for like Chat GPT plus, like actually
yeah,
throwing a little bit of money at it. And those are like my heavy tech friends.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
like that means
Yeah,
it's so early. It's so early still.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So all this to say that like, you and I having this conversation are like 5 years from now, and the reality is there's people
It always takes
who
longer.
still are.
The tech will probably grow fast, but the adoption of it will be still pretty
Exactly,
slow. Yeah.
exactly.
All righty. It's early on. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on and having this fun back and forth. This conversation has been fun. I've learned a lot, even
Yeah,
just this back and forth.
yeah.
It's
Same. Well,
it's
and
tempering
I'm
my optimism a little bit, but I think that's probably a good thing. But
well,
you're
and
right.
you've
People
made
are
me a
slow
bit
to
less
adopt
skeptical. Bit
because
less
there's
skeptical.
so many people that aren't even really leveraging automation really well yet. across the board. I hardly ever see people use automation well, other than like super basic drip sequences is usually what they're using it for. I'm like, guys, we could have done drip sequences 14 years ago. That was available then. So we're barely even cracking the surface on that, let alone what AI might be able to do.
Exactly. Exactly. But yeah, this is fun. I will be curious. We'll see if you motivate me or shame me into being more optimistic and taking your views. I believe it might be a bit of both.
Well, we'll see. Don't want to shame anybody. Hopefully, just provoke you in good ways to get on the train. If I can prove the train's worth getting on, that's the goal.
Yeah. Love it.